It began with blood, too much of it. Every mission over Europe in 1943 seemed to end the same way. Shattered bombers limping home, smoke trailing from engines, fuselages riddled with holes, and medics waiting by the runway with stretchers. The American 8th Air Force called it the 1,000-yard stare, the look in a man's eyes after watching his friends torn apart by Flak or German fighters. The air war over Europe wasn't just brutal, it was mathematical slaughter. For every 100 bomber crewmen who took off, 40 would never return. The rest came back scarred, physically or mentally. And yet, every morning they went again. But amid all this destruction, a quiet rebellion was brewing. One led not by a general, not by an engineer, but by a surgeon. His name was Dr. Drew Patterson, a U.S. Army surgeon stationed in England, near the heart of the Allied bomber operations. He wasn't supposed to invent anything. He wasn't a weapons designer or a metallurgist. His job was to patch up the broken, so the torn and try, usually in vain, to put men back together after their bodies had been shredded by steel. Day after day, he saw the same kind of wounds. Jagged shrapnel tearing through torsos, bullets piercing soft organs. Helmets save heads. Flak jackets existed for ground troops. But the men flying at 25,000 feet, the bomber crews who were supposed to be safe in their flying fortresses, had nothing, just thin aluminum and luck. Patterson couldn't stand it. He watched too many boys die on his operating table. The cold air of the surgery tent mixed with the metallic stench of blood and antiseptic. Some men would survive for minutes, some for seconds, before fading into that endless silence. He began to ask questions that, at the time, no one dared to ask. Why didn't airmen have protection? Why were they sent into combat virtually bare-chested against high-velocity shrapnel? The official answer was simple and infuriating. The Army Air Forces believed armor would make planes too heavy. Every extra pound meant less range, less altitude, less bomb load. But Patterson wasn't convinced. He'd seen men who could have lived if something, anything, had slowed down that deadly steel. So, one evening, after a particularly horrific mission debrief, Patterson made a decision that would change everything. He was going to build armor for airmen, with or without permission. The first problem? He wasn't an engineer. The second? He had no access to high-grade materials. And the third? He was about to break more than one military regulation by even attempting this. But rules meant little when death was the daily visitor. In the small hours of the night, Patterson began experimenting. He scavenged scraps of metal from crashed bombers, fragments of British body armor, even pieces of old surgical tables. He cut them, layered them, and sewed them into fabric linings using the same surgical thread he used on human flesh. At first, it was crude, awkward, heavy, and uncomfortable. But it was something. He called it simply the vest. At the base hospital, word spread quickly. The doctor was making armor. The mechanics joked about it. The officers ignored it. But the flight crews, the ones who watched their friends die, were curious. They'd try anything if it meant surviving another mission. One morning, a tail gunner volunteered to wear Patterson's prototype on a bombing run over Germany. When the crew returned, the plane was riddled with holes. But the gunner was alive. A jagged piece of flak had struck him square in the chest and stopped. The vest had dented, but it held. That story spread faster than any official memo could. Soon, bomber crews from neighboring squadrons came knocking on the doctor's door. They wanted vests, too. Patterson's small infirmary became an underground workshop. Nurses, medics, even off-duty pilots helped him cut and sew. But the military bureaucracy didn't share the enthusiasm. Word of his unauthorized project reached command headquarters. Patterson was warned, twice, to stop. He was told that unauthorized modifications to military equipment were violations of protocol. He could lose his commission, even face court-martial. Still, he kept going. He didn't care about regulations anymore. He cared about the men. By the summer of 1944, the Allies were preparing for the biggest air campaigns of the war, raids deep into Nazi territory. The stakes were higher, and so was the body count. Patterson's vests were spreading unofficially through the bomber groups. Crews began to swear by them, calling them Patterson shields. But Patterson wasn't satisfied. His vest worked, but it could be better. He began writing letters to metallurgists in London, asking about lightweight alloys. One name kept appearing: Hadfield steel, a manganese-rich alloy known for its toughness and ability to deform without shattering. It was used in tank treads, helmets, and some experimental armor plates. But it wasn't supposed to be used for personal protection. It was too rare, too difficult to shape. Still, Patterson pulled strings. He traded favors. He offered his own medical supplies as barter. And somehow, no one quite knows how, he got his hands on a small batch of Hadfield steel sheets. He spent weeks hammering, bending, and cutting them by hand, fashioning curved plates that would fit over the vital organs. The result was a vest that weighed just under 16 pounds, light enough to wear for hours, strong enough to stop deadly fragments. He tested it the only way he could, by firing at it. In a remote field behind a base hospital, he hung one of his new vests on a wooden dummy and fired with a captured MG-42. The bullets flattened. The vest survived. That moment, caught only in memory and rumor, marked the birth of something extraordinary. Without any official design bureau, without funding or blueprints, one battlefield surgeon had created the first practical flak vest for airmen. The brass didn't approve it. They didn't even acknowledge it. But the crews did. They lined up at Patterson's tent. Quietly, after dark, they'd hand him spare parachute silk, bits of leather, anything he could use to make more. And every time another plane went down, Patterson would cut open what was left of the vest, examine the holes, and learn how to make it better. He treated his workshop like a laboratory, one made of blood, steel, and necessity. By the end of 1944, his designs had reached the attention of a few sympathetic officers in London. They couldn't officially support him, but they could overlook certain supply requests. Small crates began arriving from secret sources: better steel, lighter fabric, rivets, tools. And then something extraordinary happened. The number of fatal chest wounds among bomber crews in Patterson's unit began to drop dramatically. At first, no one could explain it, but the crews knew. They were wearing Patterson's vests. The statistics were undeniable. Men who wore his armor were surviving hits that used to be fatal. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Enough to change the outcome of a mission. Enough to bring a father, a brother, or a son home alive. In a war that measured success and lives lost, Patterson's secret rebellion began saving them. Still, the official command had no idea how deep it went. To them, Patterson was just a field surgeon. They didn't realize that his invention would soon catch the attention of the top brass, and that it would trigger a quiet investigation, one that would put his entire career at risk. But by then, it was too late to stop it. The vest was real. It worked. And soon, even the skeptics would have to face the truth, because the men who wore it came home and told their stories. And that was something no regulation could silence. The secret was out. By late 1944, rumors about the mysterious steel vest had begun circulating far beyond Dr. Drew Patterson's airfield. Crews across England whispered about the doctor who defied orders and saved men from the kind of wounds that used to mean instant death. Commanders were hearing the stories too. Stories of airmen walking away from missions that should have killed them. One intelligence officer called it the miracle of the surgeon's armor. At first, the higher-ups assumed it was an exaggeration. There was no way. They thought a field doctor could have outsmarted the laboratories in Washington or the engineers at Wright Field. The U.S. military's bureaucracy didn't like surprises, and Patterson's vest was a big one. But the numbers didn't lie. Reports from bomber groups in East Anglia showed a steady decline in fatal torso injuries among units rumored to be wearing Patterson shields. Flak fragments that once ripped through bodies were now being stopped, flattened, even. The War Department couldn't ignore it anymore. In December 1944, an official investigation was launched. A small team of officers arrived at Patterson's base. They expected to find a rogue doctor dabbling in nonsense. What they found instead was a man who had built an underground assembly line. His workshop, once a simple field infirmary, was now filled with steel plates, sewing machines, and makeshift molds for shaping armor. The officers were stunned. They confiscated samples, took photographs, and interrogated Patterson for hours. Where had he gotten materials? Who had authorized it? Why had he risked his career on an unsanctioned experiment? Patterson's answer was simple. Because they were dying. That sentence silenced the room. When the officers returned to London, they carried with them several of Patterson's vests and a growing sense of unease. What if the surgeon was right? What if the Army had been sending its airmen into battle unprotected because of outdated assumptions about weight and aerodynamics? To find out, the War Department sent the vests to the Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment for testing. What happened next would change the future of aerial warfare. At the testing range, British and American engineers fired high-velocity fragments and bullets into Patterson's vests. The results were astonishing. The Hadfield steel plates absorbed the impact and deformed, exactly as Patterson had predicted. The fragments were trapped or deflected. His design worked. And it didn't just work. It outperformed several official prototypes that had been in development for years. Patterson's unauthorized experiment had beaten professionals. Word reached General Curtis LeMay of the 8th Air Force. Known for his ruthless efficiency, LeMay was skeptical of anything that added weight to his bombers. But when presented with the data, and with personal testimonies from survivors, he relented. If it keeps them alive, he reportedly said, then give the men what they want. Unofficially, Patterson's vest was cleared for limited production. However, due to supply constraints and bureaucratic politics, it was never mass-produced during the war. Instead, small batches were made in field workshops and distributed among certain bomber units. Each vest was slightly different, some heavier, some lighter, all handcrafted. For the men who wore them, these vests became talismans of hope. One waist gunner from the 91st Bomb Group later wrote in his diary, "They told us it was unofficial. I didn't care. I wore mine every flight. Took a piece of flak to the ribs once. It should have gone through me. It stopped. That doc's a damn angel." Stories like it began to pile up. First dozens, then hundreds. In one particularly harrowing mission over Dresden, a B-17 was hit by an 88mm flak burst. The ball turret gunner was struck directly by shrapnel. When they landed, medics found a massive dent in his vest, but the man inside was alive. The fragment had stopped an inch from his heart. Patterson's idea was working in real combat. But despite the growing evidence, official credit was slow to come. Patterson remained a controversial figure. Some in the command structure saw him as a reckless maverick who had undermined protocol. Others quietly admired his courage to act when the system wouldn't. By early 1945, Allied victory was within reach. But for Patterson, the war had already changed forever. He had transformed from a weary surgeon into an innovator and a symbol of defiance against indifference. He continued to refine his vest design, introducing flexible metal segments connected by reinforced fabric, allowing for better movement without sacrificing protection. The more he learned, the more he realized something profound. Most fatal wounds weren't caused by direct hits or bullets. They were caused by fragments, tiny, irregular shards of steel traveling at incredible speeds. You didn't need tank armor to stop them. You needed smart design. Patterson began to collaborate, in secret correspondence, with a handful of sympathetic scientists and doctors who were studying trauma in airmen. Together, they gathered data from hospitals across Britain. They compared wound patterns, flak trajectories, and survival rates. The conclusion was unmistakable. Protective vests reduced fatalities by nearly 60% in the torso region. 60%. That number hit the War Department like a bombshell. If Patterson's data was correct, thousands of lives could have been saved had armor been standard from the start of the air war. But the war was ending, and so was Patterson's time in the field. In April 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany, he was transferred to a medical evaluation post in France. He left behind a quiet legacy, a generation of airmen who owed their lives to his defiance. When he arrived at his new posting, there was a letter waiting for him. It bore the seal of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The message was polite, but cold. Your unauthorized activity has been noted. While your initiative has yielded promising results, further research will proceed through official channels. No commendation, no award, just a reminder that rules mattered more than results. But history has a strange way of correcting itself. After the war, U.S. military medical divisions began compiling research on protective gear. Among the files were Patterson's notes, sketches, and photographs of his handmade vests. These documents were quietly passed to researchers developing the M1951 Flak vest, the first standardized body armor adopted by the U.S. Air Force and later the Army. Though never publicly acknowledged, much of its design mirrored Patterson's original concepts: layered steel or aluminum plates sewn into flexible fabric panels, positioned over vital organs, and designed to absorb and disperse the force of shrapnel impacts. He had changed the course of military protection without ever holding a design patent or a laboratory position. And the numbers proved it. By the time the Korean War began, every U.S. aircrew member flew with body armor. Casualty rates from torso wounds dropped dramatically, just as Patterson had predicted years earlier, working alone in a dimly lit medical tent. Historians estimate that by the end of World War II, Patterson's unofficial vests, distributed quietly among bomber crews, had saved between 5,000 and 7,000 lives. No one knows the exact number. The records were incomplete, the data scattered, the names forgotten, but the impact was undeniable. He had done what the system couldn't or wouldn't do in time. Even decades later, veterans still remember the doctor who refused to accept death as routine. At reunions, they bring out the old vests, dented and scarred. One man, a former pilot, once said, "Every scratch on that metal means one of us got home." And yet, for all the lives he saved, Patterson remained largely unknown. His invention was absorbed into machinery of military progress, his name buried beneath classified reports and official claims. He returned home quietly, resumed his medical career, and never sought fame. To him, the work had always been about the men, never about recognition. Still, those who served with him never forgot. Years later, when one of his former patients tracked him down in a small hospital in Illinois, he asked Patterson if he knew how many lives his vest had saved. Patterson simply smiled and said, "I only know how many I couldn't." That line, simple, human, and heavy with truth, summed up the spirit of his creation, because for Dr. Drew Patterson, it had never been about breaking the rules. It was about refusing to accept death as inevitable. And though he never wore wings or dropped bombs, his work protected the men who did, and helped shape the armor that every modern soldier now takes for granted. When the guns of Europe fell silent in 1945, the world turned its eyes to peace, reconstruction, and the dawn of a new atomic age. Men like Dr. Drew Patterson faded into the background, replaced by headlines about victory parades and mushroom clouds. The bomber war was over. The heroes were pilots, generals, and presidents. The quiet figures who worked behind the curtains, the ones who bent rules to save lives, were quickly forgotten. But legacies have a way of lingering in steel. In the years after the war, Patterson's design continued to evolve in secret. Engineers studied the surviving notes, handwritten diagrams smudged with blood and grease. They refined his ideas, using aluminum and ballistic nylon instead of steel, creating lighter, more flexible protection. By the 1950s, his core concept had found a new name, the flak jacket. And yet, no one seemed to remember where it had begun. By the time the Korean War erupted, every U.S. airman and many ground troops wore armor inspired by his field-borne invention. The official manuals credited Army research teams, and post-war development projects. Patterson's name wasn't even a footnote. But to the men who'd seen his vest with their own eyes, to those who'd worn it into hell and back, his memory never faded. In smoky veterans' halls and dusty reunions, they told the story of Doc Patterson. They spoke of the night he pulled flak shards out of a man's chest and swore he'd never let another die that way. They told of the vest sewn by hand, the plates hammered in the dark, the defiance that saved lives. One aging gunner once said, "We were told to follow orders." He followed conscience. And that's what made the story powerful, not the steel, not the science, but the act of defiance wrapped in compassion. For decades, Patterson's work lay buried under classified files and forgotten archives. Then, in the 1970s, a young Air Force historian named Major Thomas Leland stumbled upon something unusual while researching the origins of modern flight armor. It was a series of old field reports from 1944, stamped confidential. Inside were photos, grainy black and white images, showing airmen wearing crude steel vests lined with fabric. One document bore the heading, Unauthorized Medical Modification, 8th Air Force, East Anglia. At the bottom, in faded ink, was a signature, Captain Drew H. Patterson, M.D. Leland was fascinated. He began digging deeper, through hospital records, mission logs, even veterans' letters. Piece by piece, he uncovered the forgotten truth. That one man, working alone in a medical tent, had invented the first flak vest that truly worked. He published his findings in a small Air Force historical bulletin in 1976. The article was short, just a few pages, but it reignited a spark. Letters poured in from veterans who had served under Patterson. They confirmed everything. They sent photos, diary entries, fragments of the very vests they'd worn. Some still had dents in them. It was undeniable. The myth was real. Soon, the U.S. Air Force Medical Museum requested to display one of Patterson's original vests. The exhibit was quiet, tucked between flight helmets and surgical kits, but it drew attention. Visitors stopped, stared at the dented steel plates, and read the small plaque beneath. Improvised Aircrew Protective Vest, 1944, developed by Captain Drew H. Patterson, U.S. Army Air Forces. At last, his name stood beside his work. But for many who knew the story, it wasn't enough. They wanted the world to understand what his defiance had meant. Not just aviation, but to every soldier who ever strapped on armor after him. Because Patterson's vest wasn't merely a piece of war gear. It was a statement. That compassion could be as revolutionary as courage, and that innovation sometimes comes not from the laboratory, but from the operating table. In 1984, at a reunion of the 91st Bomb Group, Patterson, then a frail, white-haired man in his 70s, was invited to speak. He hadn't seen most of those men in 40 years. When he walked to the podium, the room fell silent. He looked out at faces lined by time and memory. Many of them owed their lives to him. He began slowly, voice trembling. I was never meant to invent anything. I was just tired of watching you die. The room erupted in applause, some men standing, some wiping tears. It was a recognition he'd never asked for, but deeply deserved. A reporter who attended that night later wrote, "It wasn't a medal ceremony. It was an act of gratitude 40 years overdue." After that reunion, Patterson's story began to spread quietly through documentaries, museum panels, and oral histories. His vest was featured in a Smithsonian display on the evolution of body armor. Military scholars cited his work as one of the earliest examples of field-driven innovation, solutions born not from orders, but from necessity. And yet, Patterson himself remained humble. When asked in a rare interview how it felt to be recognized, he simply replied, "I didn't save them. The steel did." But everyone who'd been there knew better. By the end of his life, Patterson had seen his concept evolve far beyond anything he could have imagined. The same principles he discovered in 1944, layer protection, energy dispersion, mobility, became the foundation of modern ballistic armor. From the Kevlar vests of Vietnam to the interceptor systems used in Iraq and Afghanistan, his legacy lived in every soldier who stepped into combat with a fighting chance. It's ironic. The man once threatened with court-martial for building unauthorized armor had, in time, shaped the very gear that defined military survival for generations. And though his story is rarely found in textbooks, its echoes remain wherever a vest stops a bullet, wherever a medic pulls a soldier back from the brink and whispers, "You're going to make it." Because that was always Patterson's goal, to make sure more men made a home. One of the last known photographs of him, taken in 1986, shows him standing beside a display case containing one of his original steel vests. He's not smiling widely. There's a quiet, almost solemn look on his face. Some say he was remembering the men who didn't return, the ones his invention came too late to save. He passed away a few years later, quietly, surrounded by family. He never sought fame, never wrote a memoir. But those who knew him understood that behind the modesty was a man who'd seen too much loss and decided to fight it with his own hands. And maybe that's what makes his story timeless. In war, Innovation is often driven by fear. Fear of defeat, fear of being outmatched. But Patterson's came from empathy. His rebellion wasn't against authority. It was against apathy. He refused to accept that dying young was just part of the job. His defiance wasn't loud or glamorous. It was steady, human, and unrelenting. Every rivet he hammered into steel, every vest he stitched under the dim light of a field lamp, was a quiet declaration that human life was worth protecting, no matter what the rulebook said. And in that defiance lay something far greater than military ingenuity. It was moral courage. Today, his name is whispered among a small circle of historians and veterans, but his influence is worn by millions. Every modern pilot, every soldier, every police officer wearing body armor carries a piece of his legacy, whether they know or not. Some inventions win wars. Others save the ones fighting them. Dr. Drew Patterson's steel vest didn't end the conflict, but it changed its cost. It transformed survival from a miracle into a possibility, and that may be the greatest victory of all. So when we speak of heroes, we often think of the men who charge into battle. But sometimes the greatest acts of bravery happen behind a scalpel, under a lamp, in the silence between missions, where one man decides that good enough isn't good enough anymore. And because of that decision, thousands of airmen live to see peace. Some would call it luck, others destiny. But those who truly understand what happened in that small English infirmary during the dark days of 1944 know it was something far greater. It was compassion forged in steel. And it saved lives, one vest at a time.